So welcome back to our channel. Today we're going to be talking about setting up the ultimate trophy hunting farm. We're going to be using this 240 acre farm that we've managed and hunted in the past. We've had really good success, and we're going to share some of the things that we did with you guys.
Yeah, we took this farm from basically nothing and built it into a really high quality farm.
So we wanted to let you guys know, to our first 1,500 subscribers, we're going to be doing a giveaway. Whoever the winner is will have the choice between either a nested backpack, which comes with a set of climbing sticks and a tree stand, or a top-of-the-line Reconyx trail camera. All you have to do to get entered to win is subscribe to our channel and email us a screenshot that shows that you're subscribed. And then whenever we're ready to hold the contest, we'll have a deer head on display and some trail camera pictures of it. And then you guys will get to estimate the score of the deer, and whoever's the closest will get to choose between the nested backpack or the top-of-the-line Reconyx trail camera.
When we got the lease on this farm, it was obvious that it had the right habitat. It had a lot of potential, but I think in the first couple years, the biggest deer we ever saw was like 140 inches. And we took it from that to killing multiple deer over 180, the highest one scoring 205. So stay tuned and we'll show you what we did on this property, and some of these things might help you if you're ever in a position that you're wanting to raise big deer.
So starting off, we're going to talk about how the property was laid out. So here on the east side, we had a major creek that always had flowing water. And this area here was all flat bottom ground, and this was an agricultural field. This is an east facing slope. It used to be a cattle pasture, and now it's grown up in some really thick quality bedding area.
Yeah, there are some cedars in there, lots of briars, hedge trees, the occasional oak trees and hardwoods.
So this top field here, originally when we first started leasing it, was all CRP, but then a few years passed and they worked it up and started farming this as well. And then this over here on the west end was a mix of hardwood and thick bedding area. There's an access road here that came in towards the center of the property. And then there's another road on the eastern side which also made for good access. So I'm sure you're looking at this map and wondering what are all these different markings on it, and we'll go over that in a second. But first we'll talk about these bedding areas and what we did with those particular areas. This particular area right here, it held a lot of deer. It was really thick, and we treated it like a sanctuary. So that's why you don't see any tree stand markings or trail cameras in the thick of the bedding area. So this area here was pretty similar, but on the upper end it was a little bit more open. So we do have a couple spots up there where we felt like we weren't really pushing the deer as much going in to hunt them. This area down here was a younger growth of trees, but it was really thick and dense. And we kind of treated this as our secondary sanctuary. As you can see, there's really no trail camera sites or stand sites in the thick of the bedding area. So again, this piece here is bottom ground. We called it the super funnel and we hunted it quite a bit. We really had good success down in this area here. It connects some of the bigger woods to the east to the bigger woods on our property and the adjacent properties to the north and the west. It was a mix of big cottonwoods, maples, and sycamores.
Next, we'll take a look at the food sources on the property. This was, again, an agricultural field, so it was in crop rotation. It was either going to be soybeans or corn. Same for this upper field, soybeans or corn. The yellow areas that are outlined are areas that we had soybeans or corn planted as well for the deer, which was left. There's two primary areas. This one, I think, was right at 4 acres, and this one here was just over an acre. We had these set up with electric fences around them so that we could protect those crops when they were growing. Then the green areas were either in clover or alfalfa. This one in particular was a border of about 25-30 feet around the perimeter of the soybeans or corn. So we were somewhat limited on the acreage we could plant. The number of deer on this property, we really would have needed more acres of grain that would have been left for the deer, would have been better. Late season, it was easy to have 200 deer utilizing the food that was on this property, and it just would run out, in early February, late January, sometime around there. It kept them during the season, but you want to try to continue feeding those deer through those hard months, and we really didn't have the ability to do what we wanted as far as leaving enough grain for them.
So all of our stand locations marked in the darker blue are all box blinds. Down here on our crop food plot we had one, and we would access that through coming across the creek and walking up a little drainage ditch that was right here. And then we had one here, and this was on one of our clover plots. And we would access this by parking here and then walking down. There was another ditch that we could be concealed from the deer, walking straight up to that blind. And this one here was a little tricky to get to, but we had a little bit of a drainage ditch along this field edge here, so we could cross the creek and walk up that, and we'd have to cut across real slow to get to that blind, making sure we're not bumping any deer on the way in. This was one of the better box blinds that we had set up on the property, and it's really only one way in, and it's through this dirt road, which we'll talk about that later. 90% of the time when we went to hunt this spot, we were sitting all day, just because it was so hard to get in and out of without bumping a lot of deer. So this blind here, we would come up by following this black line here and walking straight there. It was a pretty easy hunt. And then this blind here, it was situated where it was on this alfalfa plot here, but about 40 yards away from the edge of the cornfield. We would catch a lot of deer coming out of these woods to go to the food, and as well coming up and feeding in the clover plot. And then this blind here was situated again along the edge of the clover and not too far from the edge of the cornfield. On this one we accessed by this dirt road. We would drive our electric buggy real slow along here, and we actually had a little spot where we parked the buggy in the brush line here. We called it the garage, where a buggy was hidden, and then we would walk up through here get in the stand.
Okay, so kind of zoom in a little bit here so that we can see things a little easier. And as you can see, there's, I think, around 27, 28 camera locations. Those are the red icons you see on the map here. We had 24 reconnaissance cameras that we ran, but sometimes we moved them around a bit. That's the reason there's a few more than the 24 marks on the map. So the light blue markings are all of the tree stands that were on the property. I forget how many, there was over 20, 25, something like that. These black lines that you see are actually trails. This is a pretty obvious one here, but some of these kind of go through, it looks like they go through the woods, but they're actually big enough that you could drive a tractor through all of these. And we kept them mowed and well maintained. We had a perimeter road completely around the agricultural field for when the field was planted in crops, so that we could still access these food plots and camera sites. The brown lines are also trails that we would actually disc right after the crop was removed. So if the farmer came in and combined the corn off, the next few days we would spend disking these trails in all of the fields, again for quiet access, so that we're not running over corn stalks or bean stubble while we're running cameras or accessing our tree stands. It left a nice quiet dirt road, and we used mostly electric buggy to run these roads to access these cameras and stand sites. And this was really critical in keeping the pressure down on the deer. Over time, the deer got really used to that buggy. Now, we would go real slow and we would be quiet. We weren't out there talking real loud. We were whispering while we were traveling these dirt roads. And we were also using, like in this particular area here, there was a pretty nice hill right here. So that's the reason for this curve in this line. We used that hill to shield us from this bedding area over here. So when we were accessing it, there was a hill all along this road here. up to about this point, down to around this point. We would stay on the opposite side of the hill with our trail so that the deer in here would never know that we were coming up the hill to access these stands or cameras. Same thing with this one. This trail was disked in on the northern side of a hill that ran right down kind of the center of this field. So again, when we were driving along this trail here, none of the deer in this area could see that we were coming through. Obviously the deer over in this area would, but this wasn't one of our main sanctuaries, and it was rare that the deer bedded in these areas. So we weren't really giving up much. While we're talking about this, the pressure that we put on the deer when we're accessing our cameras, accessing our tree stands to hunt, while we're out there actually hunting, that pressure is kind of like, I don't really know how to explain it other than it has like a snowball effect. You know, a little bit of pressure, the deer get a little cautious. Put more pressure, they get more cautious, and you keep adding to that snowball, and what you end up with is nocturnal deer, especially the older age class bucks. They just won't tolerate much pressure. So the more that you can do to minimize your hunting pressure on those deer, the more your deer are going to move in the daylight. It's just pretty simple. It's not necessarily simple to do, but it takes a little effort. But the more you can do to minimize that, the better your hunting is going to be.
So all these green icons you see here, those are all watering holes that we had added. And keep in mind, this was all high ground. Now down to the east, there was the creek that the deer could get water. But up here, there's no natural water source for them.
So I kind of mentioned in the beginning of the video how, the biggest deer that we had on this property when we leased it was 140 inches. So I kind of want to back up and kind of elaborate a little bit on that. We probably hunted this property for 3 years, 4 years, and getting to know the farm, getting to know how the deer move through the property, their comings and goings, and at the same time, putting more stands out, learning the wind directions, how we could hunt a particular area, what kind of wind it took for that area. All these things, it took us a few years to get a grasp on. And we never stopped learning right up until, the very end when we let the lease go. You never stop learning. But there were real good genetics in the area. The problem was the property had been kind of shot out. The guys who had the lease prior to us coming in were happy shooting 140 and 150 inch deer. And there was a good group of them, and they did a pretty good job at keeping those deer from reaching maturity. So I think it was on the 4th year of having the property leased, we shot a 182 typical 12, pretty clean, pretty symmetrical. So that buck was shot on this tree stand on November 13th. The way we treated this property, it was almost like the whole thing was a big sanctuary. No one around us had any food that they would leave into the late season, other than whatever waste may have been left on the ground when harvesting crops. There were no food plots in the surrounding areas, not for a couple miles. So I'm sure you can see how treating this farm very delicately, accessing it with hunting pressure in mind at all times, and having the only late season food source in the area, we pulled a lot of deer in late season. And what ended up happening is a lot of those deer got to know that over time, and they would come back during the rut, a lot of them. We would have bucks show up late season that we never saw before. Well, next year during the rut, there he was again, and this happened over and over and over again, which just increased our success. We were pulling bucks in from miles away, and a lot of them would come back the following year. Some of them would end up staying and become resident deer. But again, if we had the freedom to do what we wanted on here as far as food goes, I would have doubled or maybe even tripled the amount of food that we were able to have. Probably 14 to 15 acres of crop is what it would have took to have that crop last to the very end when you get the green up in the spring. Here we are discussing this property and how great it turned out. It was a really crazy good farm to hunt. You could go out for a hunt and sit in one of these stands that you could see a lot of terrain from, and it wasn't uncommon to see 30 bucks. plus. During the rut, there was times where I remember having 6, 7, 8 hunts in a row that I could have shot a Pope and young deer out of the tree stand with the bow. In some cases, multiple Pope and young deer on the same hunt. You know, it was that good. With the occasional really good one in the distance, or just not quite close enough. So yeah, there is a lot of things you could change about a property if you own it. For instance, you could go in and do some dozer work and build a pond, build some better roads to be able to navigate around easier. But you can't really change the makeup of the wooded areas that easy, other than going in and doing some selective cutting, maybe to thicken up some areas. This property already had really thick areas like that, so there was no need or desire to do anything about that. It was just a really nice mixture of farmland and wooded acres. This property was actually a little better than 50% wooded. So because of all of the thick growed up cattle pasture area in here and the really thick woods back in here, this property was, I would call it a main bedding type farm. The surrounding properties were more open wooded type farms, bigger timber. So the deer really, they just piled in here in the mornings and then they would leave in the evenings. So it was pretty nice set up in that way. That was just the way the deer utilized the property. So with that being said, the best time we found to run our cameras, come up through here and go around the perimeter running cameras, we would do that in the middle of the night, between dusk and midnight, depending on what the weather was going to be like. If we had a little storm coming in, say 1, 2 o'clock, we would push it to right before that storm hit. Occasionally, we would run the cameras in the daytime, but it was a very rare thing. Unless we were going in to, say, hunt a spot and we were passing by a camera or two, then we might pull those cards. But generally speaking, we would just run them at night, all in one shot. Because most of the deer would leave the property at night and we were traveling quietly on the electric buggy, the deer that were still on the property would just stand there and you'd drive right by them. We weren't up there making a bunch of noise or racket or anything like that. We were being cautious about our every move, and that just kept the pressure off of the deer. We never had a problem with the deer becoming nocturnal, ever. I can't remember one single buck that was ever even close to being considered nocturnal. But these deer would move in the middle of the daytime all throughout the day. Again, that was because of the way we treated the property and we treated the deer. Now, the surrounding areas around this property were hunted really hard. They were not treated anywhere close to the same, and ultimately that's why we gave up the lease on the farm. Better we made this property, the more the neighbors realized it, and the more they hunted and the more buddies they brought, and it got to a point of no return where we were still raising big deer right up to the end, but we were also watching every single one of our good 3-year-olds being shot, and it was just heartbreaking, because that's not what we were trying to do.
So when it comes to accessing these stands down in this flat bottom area, we had this east-facing slope here that was really thick bedding, so you had to be really careful when you were walking in to hunt these spots, because at all times when you're walking in, you'll have eyeballs on you. So just making this 150 yard walk, it may take us an hour because we're moving real slow, making sure that those deer aren't going to see you, and using the elevation to your advantage. And that was some of the things that we would do to minimize the pressure as much as possible.
Yeah, the only time we would ever go in here is if we had a deer hit and we were tracking him, or shed antler hunting. Those were the only 2 times that we would ever penetrate these areas. Even this one over here, we would never go in there except for when we were retrieving a deer or picking up antlers in the springtime. All total, there's probably 50 acres, 60 acres between this area over here and this area over here that we would just never enter those areas. I can remember doing a kind of a test one day. I had gone up well before daylight and climbed in this box stand here. And around noon, I called down to my wife and asked her to bring my daughter to hunt for the afternoon. She drove in here, stopped here with my daughter, who then walked this road up to get into the stand here with me and make the evening hunt. Right about the time she got here, this bedding area emptied out. Every deer in there exited across this opening right here, and some obviously probably went through the woods over here, but there was somewhere around 35-40 deer that I saw come out across this field, and they crossed when she was here. We had a south wind blowing that day, so the minute she got to walking along this edge here, her scent was blowing up through here like so, and she never saw a single one of those deer because I was up here already and had been there since daybreak or before daybreak. I just watched them roll out of there. She completely emptied those woods. Now, we still had a good hunt. We still saw a lot of deer. A lot of those deer did come back. But it just goes to show, just because you're not seeing them when you're walking in doesn't mean you're not pushing them. Another example of that is over on this west side. A lot of times we'd be up here hunting some of these stands, and all of a sudden we'd have deer come running across the field over here. Well, I knew the neighbors that hunted adjacent to us on the west side, and we would text each other back and forth. And sure enough, on every occasion that I was up here hunting and heard deer run in from this side, I would text those guys, and they were saying, yeah, we just got here, you know. So they were pushing deer out all the time, which, I mean, it's impossible to never push deer when you're accessing your property or accessing your stands or your cameras. But I feel you have to keep in mind that you're going to be, and how can you minimize those effects on the deer? Because if you do it on a regular basis, you're going to push the deer to become nocturnal, or you're going to push them off the property. Well, there's no easy way around it. I mean, it's just that simple. So you don't want to be that guy. You know, you can't do anything about the way your neighbors are treating their property, but you want the deer to feel safe and come over to you, rather than feel safe and go on over to the neighbors. Obviously, that's just going to increase your chances of success on a good buck, you know.
So understanding that all hunting farms are going to be different, it's going to take different tactics and different techniques to make the best hunting out of your particular property. So hopefully some of these things that we highlighted in this video that we did on our property will help you guys to be more successful and have better hunts. So as always, thank you guys for watching, and remember, hard work is more reliable than luck.